and CEO of Digital Bond and S4, Mr. Dale Peterson. And he's going to be presenting today on a subject entitled ICS Security, Defense Will Win. Ladies and gentlemen, Dale Peterson. Hey, Dale. Oh, you changed your mind.
Yes.
Let me put it on for you. You good to go?
Yep. Okay. So I went forward too far. So we've heard today quite a bit about attacks and threats and challenges when it comes to ICS security. And I'm here to give you some good news. When it comes to ICS security, defense will win. Now, this may sound shocking to some of you because you've heard over and over again, and I put a couple of quotes up here, but I could have probably filled 50 pages of quotes on how in the cyber realm, offense has the advantage. And that's viewed as just something that's going to go on forever. But if we look at history, we know that that just probably is not going to be true. Because when it comes to conflict, whatever theater, whatever type of weapons we're looking at, there's an ebb and flow. There's times when offense is predominant, and then there's times when defense is predominant. And in fact, most of the time, defense is predominant. And there have been cases, much like now, where people are saying, well, cyber offense always has the advantage. There's been cases in the past where people have thought that to be true, and it's been proven to be wrong. Probably one of the best examples was about 100 years ago, right before World War I. Bismarck had some wars at the end of the previous century where his offensive capabilities were so overpowering that the leading scholars of the time, the smartest people who knew all about conflict theory, actually came up with this term, cult of the offensive, with the idea that whoever attacked first was going to win because there was no way of defending against this offensive juggernaut. And of course, we know that proved to be false because World War I was the bloodiest defensive struggle the world had ever seen. People dug into these trenches. This next picture here shows actually those little squiggly lines are the trenches. And these two sides would face each other and fight literally for years in these trenches and move maybe 100 meters each way. So we went from offense being unstoppable to prolonged defense and no way for offense to win in literally a blink of the eye. And that's something, I don't say it's going to be a blink of the eye, but at some point, defense in cyber is going to be predominant. Unfortunately, we're not there today, and we're in a very dangerous situation because offense is carrying the day. You see article after article about how control systems are being attacked and how countries are building up this huge offensive capability. It's a cyber arms race. And I think the scariest thing I heard on this topic was from Admiral Rogers. He, in the United States, he's the director of NSA. He's basically the person in charge of offensive cyber efforts and defensive cyber efforts in the United States. And he went up in front of our Congress, very formal body, and publicly stated that the United States cannot defend itself against cyber attacks. That what we need to do is develop a crushing offensive capability because we can't defend. And what you're seeing now is a lot of nations around the world are taking that same point of view, and it's making things very dangerous. Thomas Schelling wrote a book, The Strategy of Conflict. It won a Nobel Prize, and he took game theory and applied it to conflict. And what he found was, and this has been true if you look at history, that when offense is predominant, there's a lot more conflict. And again, it's because both sides are afraid if they don't throw the first punch, they're going to get knocked out. And on the flip side of that is when defense is predominant, there is less conflict. And I think that probably makes sense to everyone out there in the audience, that's logical. What maybe isn't so logical that he found was not only does it help if your defense is better, but if you actually can help your adversary's defense get better, the chances of conflict go down. Because both sides are less worried about being attacked because they have confidence in their defense. They stop developing offensive weapons at the same rate, and security is improved. Now, this is especially potent when offensive weapons look different than defensive weapons. So, if we look here, this is a picture of Gibraltar, a purely defensive expenditure of money and resources. For example, Gibraltar cannot be used to attack France. But a fighter plane, when a country invests in something like this that can be used for defense or offense, it can make people worried. So that type of expenditure does not reduce the probability of conflict. But the good news for the ICS world is that the efforts that we spend on defense cannot be misconstrued as being offensive. So things like firewalls and application whitelisting or improving your safety or protection schemes, those are only defensive efforts. So we need to get to a world where everyone's defense is improved to reduce the likelihood of conflict in the ICS realm. Now, I think terminology is really important. So when we say today that offense has a big advantage in ICS or offense is winning, we need to define, well, what is winning here? And there's a couple of books that are out. One is Cyber War Will Not Take Place. And the other one is There Will Be Cyber War. And it points out the importance of terminology, because you would think these two books disagree violently about the facts and the future. But in fact, they agree on almost everything except for the definition of cyber war. So if we're always going to say offense is winning in ICS, well, what is winning? There's all sorts of news stories out there about quote, losing in ICS, where offensive attacks are successful. But let's take a look at the one that I find most interesting, and Graham mentioned it this morning. This is the Bowman Avenue Dam hack. And this is actually from the U.S. Department of Justice. They wrote, "The infiltration of the Bowman Avenue Dam represents a frightening new frontier in cybercrime. These were no ordinary crimes, but calculated attacks by groups with ties to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard and designed to specifically to harm America and its people." That sounds very serious until you see the picture of the Bowman Avenue Dam, which you saw this morning. Okay. Again, this is a little sluice gate. It hardly ever is operated. A couple times a year it might rain too much and they stop a neighborhood from flooding, or maybe there's a snow melt. If we as a community say anytime someone probes this deck or this something like this, if we call that losing, then yes, we will always lose. Okay, we need to rethink our definitions. Because when we're talking about a kinetic war, physical battles with weaponry, as regrettable as it is when a soldier loses his life, we don't say we lost the war or lost the battle just because a soldier lost their life. We really look at what were we trying to defend, what were they trying to accomplish with their attack, and that determines whether we win or lose. Now, I think I have two examples up here about actual consequences for two of the more famous attacks. And there's been a lot of talk about this Ukraine attack today in 2015. The thing I'd like to point out is that the actual consequence was a 1 to 6 hour power outage for 230,000 people. I don't know what the power is like in Kuwait, but I can tell you we have much larger longer power outages in the United States. And in a sense, this was actually a success story for Ukraine. Not in the fact that they had weak cyber protection and they were able to get hacked. That obviously is an area to improve on. But the fact that they actually had the capability to recover in less than 6 hours in 56 substations that were out of service. And they did that by they sent people out to the substations with radios, flipped the breakers back on, and sort of ran a manual SCADA. That's actually a success story. There would be a lot of utilities that if you could go up to them today and say, the worst thing that'll happen to you is in the next 2 years you'll have a 6-hour outage for 250,000 people. Do you accept that? They'd be really happy if that was their maximum outage. I don't think we should celebrate this, but this is really a wake-up call. And organizations need to start looking at things this way as what are the real consequences and what is an acceptable level of consequence. Just one other fact on this. In the United States, our biggest form of outages are storms come, they blow over tree limbs that take down power lines and cause outages. The electric utilities can spend money on vegetation management to cut down the trees, but a lot of them have pulled back on that because they say that cost is, we don't need to do it as often because we're willing to live with some level of outage. So as an organization, you need to look at your own risk tolerance and decide what level of security you should apply. So I would suggest that this is what we should have for winning and losing as a definition. Defense wins in ICS when it prevents very bad and costly things from happening, when it does not allow an unacceptable consequence. Now for the good news. When it comes to conflict, defense actually has the advantage over offense. And there's all sorts of works. I took a quote here from Clausewitz about how defense has an advantage. But the main thing to take from this is that the biggest advantage we have as defenders of industrial control systems is we have knowledge and control of the terrain. Okay? We understand our process. We understand our control strategy, the programs in our PLCs, our OT environment, and we can change it if we want to. The hacker or the attacker or the adversary has to figure all this out to be successful, and they don't have control. I think this was really a good way of reinforcing the point. Rob Joyce, he was the head of tailored access operations at NSA, basically the people that are tasked with doing attacks on foreign entities for the US government. And he's actually going to be Trump's cybersecurity advisor, so you'll be hearing more from him. He gave a presentation at Usenix, and throughout the presentation he drove home this one point time after time. And at the 3-minute mark he got into this. He said that his team, when they are successful, they know more about the adversary's network and systems than the owner of that system. So you have to take advantage of this key advantage, knowledge of control and terrain. We have to know our systems inside out. We need to know them better than the attacker. We can't treat them as this black box that a vendor or integrator puts in and we don't touch because we're afraid we'll break something. We need to know it inside and out. That's our biggest advantage. Ooh. Can you restart that, please? So I want to finish with, I'd like to finish with some very practical examples for you. It just keeps going. There we go. Okay, so I'd like to finish with 3 practical examples from you. Get off this conflict theory, although I think it's fascinating, give you 3 very practical examples of why defense will win. We have the first one, and this is one I'm extremely excited about because finally, we are ending insecure by design. Okay, this was a term we coined to deal with the issue that if you can actually get to the PLC, the RTU or the controller, or the protocols that communicate with them, you actually don't need to find a vulnerability, run an exploit to do what you want as an attacker. All you need to do is read the documentation, because all the features and functions you would want to affect the availability or integrity of the control system are features and functions that lack any security, like any sort of authentication. So we are now finally at the point where people like Siemens and GE and ABB and Rockwell Automation, Mitsubishi, all these vendors now are rolling out secure PLCs with authentication, with signed code, signed firmware. So you will finally be at a point where you're not entirely reliant on the security perimeter. Today, if the bad guys get in, they're going to win. In the future, we're going to actually have true defense in depth. If they get into perimeter, then they'll still have to find a way to break through this new security. And I think this is going to be a challenge for some of you, for the owner-operators out there, because you're going to deal with two different facts that you're going to have to decide which way to go, because logically they can't be said they can't both be true. The one is, you say we have this mission-critical control system that can never go down, that's extremely important, extremely valuable. And then on the other hand, you're saying we're running these PLCs and controllers that are completely insecure that we expected to last for 20 years. Okay. If you truly have this high-risk system, then you are going to have to find a way to upgrade these systems before you expect it. And so you should be looking at that now. In the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years, you're going to have to come up with a plan if you truly have a critical system to upgrade these level 1 devices. The second area comes to recovery. And this ties a little bit back to what we talked about with Ukraine. Unfortunately, in the ICS world, we've relied much too heavily on our redundancy. If the primary goes down, it fails over to a backup. If the primary control room is lost, we have the backup control room. That just doesn't work against cyber attacks because everything's networked. The backup's exactly the same as the primary. The cyber attack is going to take everything out. So Ukraine was a wake-up call here because people said, ooh, I need a better recovery strategy than just am I able to recover a couple of computers. What will you do if everything connected to your network is compromised? And what is your recovery time objective? How fast do you have to be able to recover? And then can you do it? So you actually have to test this out and run more real-world disaster recovery and business continuity exercises. Now, on the positive side, we now have virtualization. Over half of the new systems being deployed now, the computers are virtualized. Really fast to recover a virtualized system. From the research that we're tracking, you will see virtualized PLCs, which will make them fast to recover. And it would be a long talk, but I think you're actually going to see some benefit to cloud services when it comes to recovery that are coming in the future. The third and final area that I think defenders really need to focus on for defense to win is actually the one I'm most excited about, because I think this is where you can get your biggest risk reduction for the lowest cost. Most of the time when we're looking at the risk equation, we focus on the likelihood aspect. So we say, how do we reduce the likelihood that our system will be attacked? We put in security perimeters to keep the bad guys out. We patch our systems. We do all these sorts of things. And that's all good. But we shouldn't ignore the consequence side. If we can reduce the consequence of a successful attack, we can also get huge risk reduction. I think Jorg talked about this a little bit earlier, talked about safety systems. And a lot of safety systems are designed to prevent really bad consequences from happening. But they have a limitation. So this is kind of an eye test for you, but this is a document from the IAEA on a nuclear power plant. And they have to deal with, what if this bad thing happens? How are we going to stop the disaster from happening? And Ralph Langner gave this presentation at S416. And they dealt with the issue of a low-pressure heater train or a high-pressure heater train breaking down, and that would cause the feed water temperature in the nuclear power plant to go too high or too low. A very bad situation. And so this is good. So they put a system to prevent this bad thing from happening. Unfortunately, the key word that's circled there is A. So they have a solution if one of these high-pressure heater trains goes out. But what if a cyber attacker goes after multiple ones? They hadn't considered that. And this is true of most safety analysis. As Jorg said, they dealt with random threats. They didn't deal with someone intentionally trying to take out things. So we need to look at our safety systems, our process hazards analysis, the work that you've done, and you've done some good work there. You've identified the high consequence events. So what are the really bad things we need to stop from happening? But now what we have to add to that is there a way that a cyber attack could cause that really bad consequence? So you have to add cyber to your PHA. And then once you've done that, you also have to look at, we're relying on these safety systems, can they be attacked? So I don't know if this is a prediction or a hope, but we should see a dramatic change to the way safety and protection theory is done to integrate the cyber element in the next 2 to 5 years. Because I think we have a false sense of assurance that these really bad consequences can't happen because we don't expect multiple failures. Now, sometimes dealing with consequence can be very cheap and very effective. One way to do this is just to take things that cannot be attacked. Something like a pressure relief valve has no cyber component to it. And can you put in other safety systems that cannot be hacked? Either they're standalone, they're not networked to anything, or they have no cyber component. The last example I want to give you is for what I'd call a secondary control. So last year we were working with a factory in Asia that was manufacturing something that had two main components to it. It had just extremely high heat, melt through everything kind of heat, and a conveyor belt. Those were the two main things they were controlling. And the heat was monitored and controlled by a ControlLogix PLC. So if an attacker is able to get to that PLC on the network, he could turn the heat up, and then he could brick the PLC. He could load his own firmware on the PLC so it would stop operating. So basically then, the owner-operator of this factory is in a bad situation. Things are much too hot. He can either let the whole place melt down, putting a lot of people at risk, or he can hit the emergency stop button, in which case this liquid would solidify and the whole factory would be ruined. Either way, they were looking at a $50 million loss and a 6-month outage because they had no way of turning down the heat if the PLC was bricked or the PLC was unavailable. So if we took the typical security approach to this, we'd say, well, how do we stop the bad guys from sending this rogue firmware to the PLC? And how do we stop these commands? And there's some value to that. But your more effective risk reduction would be, wait a minute, can we put some local control down there so that if the PLC is unavailable, we can turn down the heat to a reasonable level and run the thing out and then shut down gracefully? And in fact, when they looked at that, they said, we used to have that. Before they put the ControlLogix PLC in, before they replaced the previous PLC, they actually had that local control. So they deployed this local control now, and they dealt with a risk that used to be $50 million in a 6-month outage, and now it's to replace the PLC, it's maybe $15,000 in a couple-day outage. And all that without deploying any new security equipment. So really look at the consequence side of this equation. And I hope in this session that you at least learned that we should be hopeful that defense will win because that's what history tells us. That that if we all can do a better job of defending, we can reduce the level of conflict in this ICS area, and hopefully got some ideas about how to defend your systems better. And that's my contact information, and thank you very much.